Billions of years ago, one event turned a barren, inhospitable planet into the oasis of life we know today. The ocean was born. It completely transformed the Earth, creating the climate that spawned a stunning array of life, including our early ancestors that first crawled out of the ocean to inhabit land.
We're looking at an animal that's really at the base of the branch in the tree of life that leads to all limbed animals, and we're a limbed animal.
The story of the ocean reflects the fragility and tenacity of life in one of the most beautiful and mysterious environments on our planet. Ultimately, the story of the ocean is the story of us. And we're just beginning to understand its complexity and the immense influence it has over all life on Earth. We live on a blue planet which is almost covered by life-giving water. But where did all this water come from? And how did it transform our planet? Geology professor Nick Isles is taking us back in time for a glimpse of what our Earth looked like 4.5 billion years ago. The Afar Depression in Ethiopia's Rift Valley is a gateway to the searing hell of Erta Ale, one of the planet's most active volcanoes. It's one of the best places to see what the early Earth was really like.
It formed out of dust particles, collecting together, brought together by gravity, meteorites bringing in more material, and it was a cluster. Think of it as a giant, red-hot snowball gathering material from space. It was a red planet. It wasn't a blue planet. There were no oceans, there were no atmosphere. It was a giant ball of red-hot magma flashing through space.
Some of this magma is still bubbling away in the searing mantle that churns just below a wafer-thin crust. This is what happens when fissures open up in that fragile crust. Volcanoes are created.
That's amazing.
Spewing out the magma that once covered the entire Earth. If this searing morass of molten rock once covered our planet, where on Earth did ocean water come from?
Well, there's been a lot of scientific debate about the origin of the oceans, and surprisingly, the answer appears to be that the ocean water came from within the planet. It was water that was squeezed out under huge, unimaginable pressures from rocks and minerals. Imagine the forces that are taking place deep within the planet, and the water outgassed from the deep interior of the planet and pooled on the hot surface.
Water vapor entered the atmosphere as superheated steam. As it cooled, it condensed and rained down on the surface. Water pooled in depressions, and these pools slowly grew into the oceans we know today. The ocean reshaped the Earth's surface and ultimately transformed it into a temperate planet that could support life. Half of the oxygen we breathe comes from plants living in the ocean. The ocean acts as the planet's thermostat. It regulates temperature and stops the Earth's surface from getting too hot or cold. The ocean controls surface temperature through evaporation. As water evaporates off the ocean, it absorbs an enormous amount of heat. Without it, the Earth would be inhospitably hot, reaching temperatures of 60 or 70 degrees Celsius. Even those who live far from the coast are subject to its immense influence. It drives the weather and climate patterns around the globe. An expert in geology and biology, Eric Gaidos is studying how the ocean affects the Earth's climate.
This water was and will be the ocean. Just a few days ago, it evaporated from the ocean. And now, after falling as rain in Kauai, this water is a mere few hours from completing its journey back to the sea. So the Earth's water is constantly in motion. In fact, 60 Amazons of water vapor constantly pass above our heads. Without that water, without the rain, all this life could not exist, and the land would be a desert.
The ocean not only shaped the Earth's surface and created our temperate climate, but nurtured life itself. When a single cell first formed some 3.5 billion years ago. Fossil expert Peter Ward is about to explore some of the world's oldest living fossils, preserved in a remote and sparsely populated corner of Shark Bay in Western Australia.
I think this is a view of what the world looked like, all the world's oceans, from 3.5 billion years ago to 500 million years ago.
They may look like rocks, but these stromatolites are very much alive. They're made up of layer upon layer of sticky bacteria that are gradually covered in a buildup of sand and dirt, giving the layers a rock-like appearance. These unique formations are a living record of how life began.
We geologists have our own pilgrimage, and every one of us sooner or later has to come right here. This is probably the most sacred spot on the planet for geology. It's a window back into time. There's nowhere else on Earth where you can see this, where you can really see what the planet was like, starting with the start of life itself, all the way up to almost 500 million years ago.
Stromatolites once covered the ancient ocean floor.
Every time we find fossils of marine rocks, there are stromatolites in them, but they're gone now. And the disappearance of them really can be thought of as perhaps one of the first and most disastrous of all mass extinctions for life.
These are all that's left of a colony that once covered the entire ocean floor. The rest were wiped out, consumed by life forms the stromatolites helped create. For billions of years, the Earth was oxygen-free. The ocean was filled with anaerobic bacteria that thrived without oxygen, obtaining all their energy from rocks and minerals.
We can think of early life itself in ways somewhat analogous to energy in our society. I mean, right now we are fueled mostly by coal and oil, but we're switching to solar, aren't we? Well, early life was like that. Early life took its energy right out of rocks as we take it right out of oil wells. But very quickly, all that solar power, that untouched resource, became available simply through the evolution of one specialized type of cell, a pigment that could take sunlight, combine it with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and build cell-living material.
Stromatolites use these pigmented cells to harness the sun's energy. This reaction, called photosynthesis, released one revolutionary byproduct: oxygen.
The presence of oxygen was, in reality, just a mistake. It is a byproduct, simply a metabolic byproduct. It's not as if any plant really cares much about oxygen at all. They just toss it away during photosynthesis.
The oxygen emitted by the stromatolites accumulated in the ocean and the atmosphere over hundreds of millions of years. Oxygen allowed more and more complex life to develop, eventually leading up to the ocean's earliest creatures.
The stromatolites around me were really the agents of their own destruction in a way. Animals themselves, newly evolved about 550 million years ago, could not photosynthesize, obviously. They're not plants, but they needed energy. They need food. Well, food is all around us. The most reliable food at that time were stromatolites. And so the early animals, which were capable of motion, had jaws, they had little rasping tongues if they were mollusks, and they just grazed. They grazed these stromatolites right out of existence.
These few remaining blobs of grit-encrusted bacteria are all that's left of a species that had the most explosive impact on the creation of complex life on Earth.
We animals, of course, would not be here without these stromatolites, or at least their great deep-time forebears. They gave us the oxygen atmosphere. Stromatolites made Earth an Earth-like planet. Charles Darwin recognized that all life on Earth today came from one first cell somewhere. Each of us is at the top of a great, rich tree. That family tree of ours has these stromatolites way down near its very base. We should revere these things. They did their job, if you want to say that, but certainly without them, we would not be here.
Life on this planet started in the ocean, and to this day, scientists are still discovering new species of life at every turn, and in some of the most extreme environments imaginable. The sun is supposedly the giver of life, but ocean biologist Verena Tunnicliffe has seen how life thrives in some of the deepest and darkest crannies of the sea floor.
The first time our expedition discovered hydrothermal vents was actually the first time on the Juan de Fuca Ridge out off Canada, and that was about 25 years ago, and the feeling was just like walking into another world. I was in a manned submersible, so you're down under the ocean, nearly 2,000 meters, and it's a totally alien, quiet world that's crystal clear. And then you go from black lavas into this vents with black smokers and animals all over the place. It's just like going into an oasis.
But this undersea Eden is the harshest environment ever found. Poisonous gas, searing heat, heavy metals, extreme acidity, overwhelming water pressure, this seafloor ecosystem seems unearthly. Yet an amazing array of life has adapted and thrived around these hellish vents. These so-called black smokers are volcanically powered. They're not belching smoke, but superheated streams of mineral-rich, recycled water. This water originally seeped down into the Earth's mantle through cracks on the ocean floor. Superheated, it dissolved toxic heavy metals. Before boiling back up through the sea floor. When the superheated stream hits frigid seawater, the dissolved minerals and heavy metals precipitate out again, creating the black plumes and solid chimney-like structures. "25 years after the first smokers were discovered, there is still much to explore and learn about the life that flourishes in an inhospitable environment.
You look at extreme conditions and you realize that where there's energy, there will always be life. And so we study the vents today. We see those adaptations of animals that can deal with fluctuating temperatures, or animals that have specific ways of getting oxygen out of the water, or animals that can deal with the big temperature gradients. And we see the adaptations. We see them in very different from anywhere else we look in the ocean, and thus have a window on the evolutionary process.
It turns out that both simple and complex life forms are all sustained by tiny bacteria. They thrive around the turbulent, toxic vents, feeding on the searing chemical cocktails streaming out of them.
So the hydrothermal vent ecosystem is an ecosystem that works on something called chemosynthesis, not photosynthesis like the rest of the planet does.
The chemical energy that powers this remote ecosystem is harnessed by anaerobic bacteria. Like the first life forms to colonize the oceans, these bacteria feed on minerals instead of oxygen.
So the fundamental grass in this system are microbes. That's the basis of the whole ecosystem.
Life has found a way to thrive where it shouldn't. And it's all built on the back of microscopic creatures that support a host of other species. These animals have ingeniously adapted to the violent and volatile environment surrounding them.
So the basic food source in the system is bacteria. And all of these animals have to figure out some way of getting that bacteria. There are some animals that have gotten to the point where, well, I don't want to spend all my energy, grazing bacteria. There's some crabs that grow the bacteria on their claws, and they put their front claws out into the water flow, and they sit there growing the bacteria like grass, and then they bring them in and they just lick their hands, and then they put them back out again.
These extreme conditions promote adaptation. Survival depends on finding new, creative ways to feed, grow, and reproduce.
It's really instructive to look at what we call extreme environments, because you can begin to see the different solutions to problems that the environment throws at life on this planet. So looking at an environment like a hot vent, begin to realize that things that we consider are huge problems in our world have been solved by animals somewhere in the evolution of life. When we look at an ecosystem like the hydrothermal vents, we realize that life often can make the most of almost any setting. And so, given just the slightest chance, life is probably going to take it.
Life can adapt to extreme environments when it has to. But when given more favorable conditions, it explodes into a kaleidoscope of variations. Around 600 million years ago, multicellular animals started to take over the ocean. The first coral and sponge reefs provided ideal homes. Tight spaces and maze-like designs feed and protect a multitude of species. Their populations are kept in check by predators higher up the food chain. A thriving coral reef teems with life of every shape, size, and color. It's hard to imagine that these sun-scorched, barren bubbles of rock were once vivid, vibrant coral reefs. More than 400 million years ago, the brilliant blue life-giving waters receded, leaving a perfectly preserved corpse of a coral reef in a sheltered, remote landscape in the far north of Western Australia.
I've seen plenty of Devonian reefs, but every single Devonian reef I've ever seen has been subjected to millions of years of insult by the planet, tilted up or squished or turned into some other rock. The extraordinary aspect of this place, this reef lived and died and then was left completely alone by Mother Earth. It's as if somebody, the last person out, took the key and locked it up and said, "See you later," and off they went. This is the best preserved ancient coral reef of anywhere on the planet.
These are the scant, skeletal remains of what was once a mighty global network of reefs. During the Devonian period, more than 400 million years ago, barrier reefs built up in shallow waters around the continents. Life on land was sparse. There were no dinosaurs or amphibians. Even plants had only recently migrated to put roots into the developing soil. But the ocean was an entirely different story.
We could go to the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, look at that clear water, examine those reefs, and we would have a very good picture of what it would have looked like. This is the so-called age of fishes because there were more fish of more different kinds, of unbelievable difference to what we have today. Biodiversity is enormous. The water would be crystal clear. We would see a wall, the wall would be covered with corals. But way more than that, there'd be archaic creatures now extinct. We're looking at a time before we had all the fish of today. These are archaic, they have big scales, they're clunky, they would kind of look like swimming tanks. But it would be so colorful, so diverse, so filled with life that we could compare it to the modern day reefs. I'm holding a piece of reef that came from this rock behind me. Every bit of white that you see in this hunk of rock was formed by an animal. Not just an animal, thousands of species of animals, coral-like animals and true corals themselves, building skeletons, growing up into sunlight, making a giant coral city. Now look right behind that. The rocks turn black. The rocks above this, the younger rocks, have been taken over by something entirely different. It's no longer an animal reef, it's now a microbial reef. The animals are wiped out. What takes over was what was present on Earth before animals, microbes. It was one of the greatest mass extinctions in the history of the planet. This place is a graveyard, and we are just now beginning to understand what caused that. And personally, it scares the holy business out of me, because what caused that very much could happen again in our world.
More than 99.9% of species that ever lived on this planet are now extinct. They've come and they've gone. There have been 5 major extinctions in the past 540 million years. More than half of all the life on Earth was wiped out each time.
When I began my career, we thought that every one of the mass extinctions had been caused by a large body impact, a comet or an asteroid hitting the planet. It made great sense. Some huge rock the size of Mount Everest hitting the planet, throwing up dust, making the whole atmosphere dark. Sure, it would kill things. But over the last 10 years, that whole idea is beginning to change. We still think the dinosaurs were indeed killed off by a large asteroid hitting the planet. But there may have been as many as 14 other mass extinctions caused by something entirely different.
That entirely different something was not a huge asteroid, but a minute, microscopic bacterium. How could something so small change the entire planet?
The edge of this really stagnant river in Australia is a great place to illustrate what happened at the end of the Devonian. All over the edge of this, we find bacteria. This is blue-green algae, we call it, but it is a bacterium. It's here because there's almost no oxygen in this water because it's so hot. These things cover over whatever animals were present and suffocate them. Well, the same thing happened at the end of the Devonian with these coral reefs. The water got so warm it lost its oxygen. The microbes grew over the top of the corals and smothered them. Microbes which love hot, microbes which love dirty, oxygen-free water, microbes which use slime to build upon what the animals left behind.
These bacteria are anaerobic. Oxygen kills them instantly. Their blackened mass remains cover ancient coral reefs. It means the ocean must have lost all of its oxygen. How on earth could that have happened? Oxygen gets mixed into the ocean by the churning action of waves, currents, and tides on the surface. But it's the great ocean conveyor that takes oxygen to the ocean's depths. The conveyor moves surface water, warmed at the equator, toward the poles. As the water cools, it becomes denser and sinks, delivering life-sustaining oxygen to the depths.
How do we turn off the conveyor? We simply remove the difference in temperature between the poles and the tropics. We warm the poles, we keep the tropics the same temperature. That conveyor, which is driven by heat differences, stops. When it stops, we lose oxygen on the bottom, and we start the mechanism to mass extinction.
Once the conveyor shuts down and the ocean becomes stagnant, a deadly chain reaction is put in motion.
The reefs were in water that became warmer and warmer. Warm water holds less oxygen. The animals strangled and died. The microbes grew right over the top. Worse things then started to happen. In that warm water, not only did we get green microbes like this, but a second entire type began to grow, a microbe that produces the very toxic poison hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is a killer.
This lethal bacterium gets its energy by breaking down sulfur, creating a deadly byproduct, hydrogen sulfide.
These microbes began to take over not just the reefs, not just the shallow waters, but all the oceans. Huge bubbles of hydrogen sulfide come out of solution. They hit the surface, they pop out, they rise into the sky. In so doing, they poison the animals. They poison plants on land. They filled the atmosphere with toxic hydrogen sulfide. The bodies are stacked up on the beach or on the bottom of the ocean. But the ocean itself has changed entirely in its color. It's purple now. It's totally filled with purple sulfur bacteria. The sky takes on a vaguely greenish cast. A purple ocean, a green sky, a world without animals, a world replete, filled with microbes. That's the aftermath of a greenhouse mass extinction.
Scientists now believe that this catastrophic chain of events caused all but one of the 5 major extinctions.
Well, the mass extinctions, we now believe, were times when the evil empire, if you will, the first life on Earth, the microbial life, fights back. It makes a huge comeback. We animals think with our complexity we're here forever, but that's not the case. Environmental conditions are so narrow for we animals. Our conditions for temperature are narrow, for acidity, for the salt in the water, slight variation and we die. Microbes can take hotter temperatures, colder temperatures, greater acid, greater salt, less salt. In all ways, they're much more widely adapted and adaptable. Microbes will be the last life on this planet. And so the rock record really is this kind of uneasy back and forth between the animals and the microbes. Dominance by one group, mass extinction, dominance by another. This skating back and forth between these two very different kinds of life.
But there are certain traits that have allowed a few unique creatures to survive all the mass extinctions. There are creatures called living fossils that are somehow able to survive onslaughts of global microbial poisoning and the emergence of new predators.
Just like in any good army movie, there's always some survivors. You can't wipe out everybody. In the mass extinctions, not all the animals got wiped out. Obviously, here we are, surrounded by this animal-rich world.
Living fossils are just examples of the fact that once in a while evolution gets it supremely right early in the game. You never have to change anything.
But really, one of the most interesting areas of research is to figure out why. Why did some die, and why did some live?
The answer to that question may lie in one of the Earth's greatest ever survivors, the Nautilus. It wasn't the biggest or the deadliest, or even the fastest, yet somehow it outlasted them all.
Here's an animal, 500 million years. I put my 500 million year old Nautilus up against any other animal on this planet. How do you survive 500,000 years? I mean, humans are only 200,000 years. 200,000, we're not a million. 500 million, they've got secrets. They know something, they're doing something right.
Well, and what have they got to teach us about surviving mass extinctions? So there could be some pretty important things to learn.
One of the most northerly reefs of Australia's Queensland coast, Osprey Reef, is a haven for these ancient survivors. A close look at this creature's ingenious adaptations may reveal what makes it such a robust survivor.
I think this could be the smallest one we've ever caught.
God, I love these things. They're so beautiful. Thanks, evolution, for giving us Nautiluses.
Very good. All right.
Its graceful propulsion is powered by breathing. They breathe by passing water over their gills, which is then expelled through a narrow tube. When the Nautilus wants to move up, it simply points the tube downward. This prehistoric marvel adapted the world's first jet propulsion system.
Yes, it's pumping water through there to let itself move around. But with that same energy, it is also putting water across its gills. It is respiring. Respiration has to be one of the most important drivers of evolution ever.
This innovation is probably what saved the Nautilus when other marine animals succumbed to the greenhouse extinctions.
The mass extinctions are really times when oxygen levels in the ocean diminish. The creatures which seem to skate through best are those which can deal with this low oxygen level. They are pumping water at such high volume across their gills that even if that water has very few little oxygen molecules in there, by taking a huge volume, you're going to get them. While I'm swimming, I'm respiring. It's a beautiful system.
500 million years ago, these graceful creatures ruled the ocean. The reigning predators stalked crab-like trilobites, attacking from above and snapping through their thin armor with powerful jaws.
Evolution is very much like a war, and we could think of the nautiloids as the first airplanes coming in on ground troops. And so the ability of them to crunch through creatures that, with their armor, thought they were already impervious. No, these are like big tank busters. These things are coming in, swooping down, busting open these trilobites, and then eating the crew.
The tank busters' survival over hundreds of millions of years is probably down to a combination of excellent adaptation, genes, and luck. But that good fortune may be about to run out.
They've gone through there for every single one of the big 5 mass extinctions. They've gotten through greenhouse extinctions. They've gotten through asteroid extinctions. They've done it through a multiplicity of ways, and luck was certainly one of them. The real question now for a lot of these animals and plants is, yeah, they've gotten through the past, but will they get through the near future? And a lot of people say that we are in a 6th extinction. I don't know if we are or we are not, but the chances are that biodiversity is dropping and dropping fast right now. And so you ask, can these long-term survivors survive us?
It's happened many times in the past. Marine animals stopped evolving, while other species made incredible adaptations that allowed them to crawl out of the ocean and onto land. Fossils allow paleontologists like Ted Deschler to travel back in time. In this case, back to the critical moment when the first creature crawled out of the ocean and onto the mud. High in the Canadian Arctic, he uncovered a 375-million-year-old fossil, a missing link that reinforced Darwin's original theory that land-based animals originally came from the sea.
When we went up to Ellesmere Island, we first started to see it in our quarry, and we were first excavating and realizing we actually had found something. One of our colleagues saw 2 jaws start to emerge from the rock and called us over, and we all got very excited, because when you see 2 jaws coming together in articulation, as we say, then perhaps the whole skull is going to be there. And indeed, as we started to excavate a little further, we saw these 2 jaws, we saw a piece of a snout, and we knew that we found a complete skull with jaws, and if we were lucky, even more of the body. And that was the first big find of Tiktaalik. There were many of those eureka moments, but yeah, it's one of the reasons I'm in paleontology, is for those discovery moments. It's really exciting.
They dubbed the fossil Tiktaalik, or fisherpod, half fish, half 4-footed animal. An iconic creature that changed life on Earth forever when it crawled out of the primordial ooze and onto land.
So when we look at Tiktaalik, we see an animal that has a lot of features of fish, but also many features of the earliest limbed animals. And that's what makes Tiktaalik very important. It shows us that transition between finned animals and limbed animals.
It's the kind of primordial mud-like scene that saw the first of our ancestors, dubbed Tiktaalik, crawl onto land. Delaware Bay is on Northeast America's Atlantic coast.
One of the questions that always interests us is to understand the selective pressures that would have created animals like Tiktaalik. And the environments where we find the fossils are ancient settings, not unlike where I'm standing right now, the floodplains of streams, very muddy, lots of these sort of backwater settings. And these are places where it would have been a selective advantage to be able to move through shallow water, around plants, around stumps, and find your prey, and also to escape the larger predators.
Before Tiktaalik was able to crawl out of the ocean, an incredible revolution had already begun on land.
When we look at the history of the Earth, 4+ billion years of time, the ocean has always been the cradle of life. It has conditions that are conducive to life, whereas land has always been a very, very harsh place, really until plants invaded the land about 400 million years ago. And once plants made that transition, it created an ecological niche that other animals then began to exploit. So if plants hadn't first made the transition to land, creating these sort of swampy wetland habitats, then vertebrates would never have made that transition either.
Tiktaalik was the first animal to feature specific physical characteristics that can now be found in countless species across the globe.
Looking at Tiktaalik, we're looking at an animal that's really at the base of the branch in the tree of life that leads to all limbed animals. And we're a limbed animal. In fact, there's many features of Tiktaalik that we see in all of the subsequent limbed animals, including ourselves.
Even the simplest of movements, like turning the head from side to side, came from this ancient creature. Tiktaalik was the first vertebrate to develop a free neck, allowing the head to move independently of the shoulders, a good adaptation for catching prey in confined, swampy environments. Its other anatomical innovations included mobility in the wrist joint, meaning it could propel itself forward by flexing its wrist. It's a physical trait that's been passed down through all limbed animals, including us.
It's important to realize that Tiktaalik was an animal that was developing features that were useful for survival in that environment, to catch prey and to escape predation. And then later on, as new ecological opportunities occurred, and we're talking millions and millions of years, descendants of Tiktaalik developed additional features that allowed them to exploit the land and eventually be free of the water completely. So what we see in Tiktaalik is an animal that was still primarily aquatic, but developing the features that would become useful in the future for animals that would exploit the land.
Each of us carries more than 3.5 billion years of history inside of us. Every organ, cell, and gene has a physical connection to the rest of life on Earth. To make sense of our own bodies, we need only to examine the evolutionary history we share with all living things, from microbes to mammals.
When we look at our own bodies, we can see that we share an awful lot in common with our closest relatives, the great apes, and further down to amphibians and even fishes. And Tiktaalik is that connection to fishes. But we can go even deeper in the evolutionary tree, and we can see even more primitive forms and the innovations and the adaptations of those primitive forms for life in the oceans is something that we still carry with us. And so I think we really do have this deep, deep connection to our history, which started in the oceans. And it's here in our own bodies, we can see it, and it's in our psyche as well.